On a quiet spring day in the Canadian town of Sudbury, the morning routine was shattered by a shocking and mysterious crime. In a small house on Delawnay Street, a woman's lifeless body was discovered. She lay in the kitchen, as if she was just about to have a cup of tea, but instead met her end. That evening, as news of the crime spread through Sudbury, investigators received a call and rushed to the scene. The setting appeared deceptively ordinary, which only added to its eerie nature. The modest house, decorated with artificial flowers and family photos, was in disarray, showing clear signs of a struggle. 2 empty tea bags lay on the table, along with a cold kettle, while broken dishes and a torn tablecloth littered the floor. The victim, Evelyn McKinley, a 68-year-old widow, seemed like someone who led a simple and secluded life, but as it turned out, her quiet life hid something far from ordinary. In the neighboring house lived her longtime friend and, as it turned out, rival, 72-year-old Betty Donovan. At one point, Betty and Evelyn, both retired, were friends who shared secrets and evening tea. But everything changed when a 19-year-old young man named Justin Taylor entered their lives. Justin was a charismatic and attractive young man who seemed full of contradictions. He was old enough to understand his actions, but young enough to naively be drawn to easy money and compliments from older women. For Justin, whose family had always lived on the edge of poverty, the help from Evelyn and Betty was a lifeline. He accepted money and gifts without asking too many questions or caring much about the emotions behind them. According to neighbors, Evelyn and Betty had practically lost their minds over Justin. They competed for his attention so fiercely that it seemed like more than just an attempt to help someone in need. For them, the young man became their last chance to feel young and needed again. Their quarrels grew more intense, escalating from arguments over who had the right to spend time with Justin to open threats. Evelyn even told her acquaintances that Betty was crossing all boundaries, and that she would do anything to keep Justin by her side. During the investigation, the police uncovered many details about their relationship. The entire struggle over Justin was surrounded by jealousy and suspicion. Evelyn would keep tabs on Betty, call her late at night and threaten her, but Betty didn't hold back either. They exchanged anonymous threatening letters, and it even reached the point where Evelyn was spotted near Betty's house holding a hammer. Local residents thought it was just another ridiculous episode of their feud, but as it turned out, it was heading toward a real tragedy. Investigators examining the crime scene noticed something strange. Among the mess on the kitchen table were empty blister packs of strong sleeping pills. Analysis of the contents of the cups revealed that one of them contained a lethal concoction made with those pills, while the other was untouched. This suggested that Evelyn might have known or suspected that someone was trying to harm her and had tried to protect herself but failed. Investigators questioned Betty, who had been displaying strange behavior in the days leading up to the crime. She avoided neighbors and kept to herself, rarely leaving her home. Her eyes showed something beyond mere fear or anxiety. It seemed like she knew more than she was letting on. Within 24 hours of the investigation, the police found another clue. A strange letter written in Betty's handwriting, accusing Evelyn of stealing her happiness, and stating that Evelyn had to be punished. The letter hadn't been sent. It lay on a table, as if Betty was unsure whether to send it. This letter became a crucial piece of evidence in the case. Neighbors recalled that just weeks earlier, Betty and Evelyn had a loud argument right on the street. They yelled at each other, accusing one another of manipulating Justin, and swore that neither of them would let him go without a fight. It was dramatic enough that a few passers-by stopped to watch how it would end. And now, only a few weeks later, one of them had been found dead. The circumstances that put Justin at the center of this drama remained a mystery. At first glance, he was just a young guy unlucky enough to be caught between 2 feuding women. But his relationship with both women, and his skill in manipulating their emotions, led investigators to suspect that he might have played a more active role in the conflict. Justin claimed that he loved Evelyn like a grandmother, and Betty like a mentor, but messages were found in which he promised each of them his undivided attention. In Betty's house, the police found a kitchen knife with traces of blood matching Evelyn's. Betty insisted on her innocence and claimed the knife could have been planted, but all the evidence pointed to her delivering the fatal blow to her rival in a fit of rage. Her arrest was only a matter of time. The district prosecutor stated that the case had too many layers, each representing a new puzzle for the investigators. The complicated relationships between three people, two elderly women and a young man, weren't just a story of love or affection. It was a story of manipulation, jealousy, and a need for validation that led to a tragic end. For Betty, this struggle for attention became her life's purpose, and when she realized she was losing, her despair reached a breaking point. At this stage, investigators were trying to determine if Justin had any personal interest in the tragedy. Too much of his behavior seemed off. His calm demeanor upon hearing of Evelyn's death, his cold attitude toward the situation, and his lack of willingness to cooperate with the police. Moreover, it turned out that just days before the crime, he had taken out a life insurance policy in which Evelyn named him as the beneficiary. This detail became a new mystery, prompting investigators to focus on examining the connection between Justin and Betty to understand how deeply they were involved in this dark game. Betty, now sitting in a holding cell, began speaking about how Justin had turned her against Evelyn, making her believe that only she mattered to him and that Evelyn was merely using him. She claimed her actions were provoked, that she could no longer endure the humiliation and constant presence of her rival in her life. The day after Betty Donovan's arrest, the town of Sudbury was abuzz with rumors and discussions. Despite the numerous pieces of evidence, something about the case seemed off. Locals whispered that the story involving the knife was too simple for such a complex drama. Meanwhile, investigators continued their work, trying to untangle the web of lies, deceit, and manipulation. While Betty was in a holding cell, investigators decided to work with Justin. His calmness and indifference continued to alarm the investigators, and they decided to press the young man to see his reaction. Summoning him for questioning, they watched as he sat down at the table with a slight smile, as if knowing something they didn't. This young man, who appeared to be just a pawn in the game between the elderly women, could turn out to be a far more important figure in this strange chessboard. "Justin, we need to ask you a few questions about Evelyn and Betty," the investigator began, not taking his eyes off the young man. "You were close to both women, and we know they were constantly fighting over you. You realize that makes you a central figure in this investigation?" Justin, tilting his head slightly, looked calmly at the investigator. His eyes were cold, with not a trace of fear. "I was just helping them. They were lonely, and I made their lives a bit better." "What's criminal about that?" he replied, barely holding back a smile. His words sounded believable, but there was something in his tone that made the investigator uneasy. The situation took a new turn when investigators began analyzing phone calls and messages between Justin and Betty. Their conversations showed that the relationship was much more complicated than it appeared at first glance. Some messages were full of care and support, while others were filled with hints and threats. "You know what you have to do if you want him to stay with you," Justin wrote to Betty just a week before the crime. These words opened a new aspect of the case. Was Justin the one pushing Betty to take this drastic step? Investigators also decided to thoroughly examine Justin's financial situation. It turned out that he had access to both women's bank accounts and that significant amounts of money had been withdrawn from their accounts in recent months. Justin insisted that the money was gifted to him, but investigators began to suspect that this was part of his plan to manipulate the two elderly women. At the same time, forensic experts were once again sent to Evelyn's house for a more detailed examination. Among Evelyn's belongings, they discovered a stash of letters written in her own hand. These letters were addressed to Justin and contained confessions of love and despair. In one of them, Evelyn wrote, "I can't bear the thought of you being with her. She's too cruel and doesn't understand how much you mean to me." These lines suggested that Evelyn was on the brink of a nervous breakdown, which made her vulnerable to manipulation. But the most troubling find was yet another letter found in Evelyn's home. It was unfinished, and its contents made the investigators shudder. In it, Evelyn addressed someone unnamed, implying that her life was in danger. "I know you want to get rid of me. I see it in your eyes. You won't leave me alone until I'm gone from this life, but I won't go down without a fight." This letter indicated that Evelyn knew of an imminent threat, and perhaps even suspected where it might come from. Meanwhile, Betty, in her holding cell, began to talk. Her statements were full of contradictions, but one thing became clear. She was on the verge of despair. She claimed that Justin played on her emotions, pushing her to extreme actions. He told me I had to prove my love. He said that if I didn't do it, I would lose him forever, she admitted in a trembling voice. This statement added even more fog to an already convoluted case. Who was the real culprit? A woman who had lost her sanity over jealousy, or a young man who used his admirers for his own gain? Alongside interrogations and evidence analysis, the investigation began receiving anonymous calls. One of them turned out to be particularly interesting. A male voice on the other end claimed to have seen Justin near Evelyn's house on the night of the crime. I saw him around midnight. He was standing on the corner of the street, searching for something in his pockets. I thought it was strange, but I didn't pay it much attention, the caller said. This call cast doubt on Justin's alibi, as he claimed he was at home the night of the crime. Investigators decided to take a closer look at Justin's whereabouts on the day of the crime. His phone records showed that he was indeed near Evelyn's house on the evening of the incident. This information gave new momentum to the investigation. Perhaps Justin was not just a manipulator, but an active participant in the wrongdoing. But what was his ultimate goal? Money, control, or something even darker? As the investigation delved into Justin's personal connections, it became clear that he was involved not only with Evelyn and Betty. Evidence emerged suggesting he had a relationship with another woman, significantly younger than his two admirers. This new figure, whom investigators had yet to identify, could hold the key to understanding his motives. Who was she? And could she be the one for whom Justin was willing to go to extreme lengths? Investigators reached out to Justin's friends and acquaintances, trying to understand what kind of person he really was. One of his school friends, who wished to remain anonymous, described him as someone who always knew how to connect with anyone, but was never sincere. He knew how to say what people wanted to hear. He liked being surrounded by attention and care. I wouldn't be surprised if he orchestrated all this chaos for his benefit, the friend said. Gradually, investigators began piecing together a picture in which Justin appeared as a cold-blooded manipulator, using his charm to achieve his goals. But to charge him with a crime, they needed solid evidence. All the suspicions, guesses, and even Betty's contradictory statements were not enough for an indictment. Investigators knew they needed something more, something that would put an end to this case and reveal who was truly behind Evelyn McKinley's death. It was at this point that investigators came across another crucial piece of evidence. In Betty's handbag, which had been confiscated during her arrest, they found a voice recorder. On a recording made a few days before the crime, there was a conversation between Betty and Justin. Justin's voice sounded calm but cold. "You know what you need to do. Evelyn won't leave on her own. If you want us to be together, you'll have to make a decision." This was precisely the evidence that could shed light on Justin's true role in the tragedy. Now investigators faced a difficult dilemma. On the one hand, Betty had committed the crime, and her guilt was evident. On the other hand, Justin seemed to be behind the scenes, directing the actions of both women, playing on their weaknesses and desires. This case was becoming increasingly tangled, and it seemed that each new answer only led to more questions. The release of the voice recording sparked a wave of public outrage. People were shocked at how coldly a young man could manipulate two elderly women. The question of his responsibility for Evelyn's death became a central topic of discussion in Sudbury. Some believed he deserved punishment no less than Betty, if not more. Others argued that Betty was an adult woman and was responsible for her actions regardless of who pushed her. The prosecutor decided to use the recording as the main trump card against Justin. He was summoned for another interrogation, this time with new evidence in hand. When they played the recording for him, he lost his composure. His face twisted, and for a moment, panic flashed in his eyes. "This is not what you think," he began, but his voice betrayed him. Now the investigators knew their suspicions were justified, but the question remained. What was Justin's true motivation? Was it simply a desire to get rid of one of the women to gain full control over the other and her money? Or were his goals much deeper and darker than investigators could have imagined? Justin fell silent, his gaze empty, as if he was lost in thought. realizing that his game was coming to an end. Investigators understood that their work was not yet over. They had to not only prove Justin's guilt, but also understand why this tragedy had occurred. What drove him to play with the emotions of elderly women, manipulate them, and ultimately push one of them to commit a crime. The answers to these questions could shed light not only on this crime, but also on the darker sides of human nature that sometimes hide behind the mask of ordinary people. The events surrounding the tragedy in Sudbury continued to unfold, with each new day bringing fresh discoveries. Investigators understood that they were only scratching the surface, and that all the circumstances of this case concealed even more mysteries. Now that the main players had been identified, small details began to emerge that could shed light on what happened that ill-fated night. The first discrepancies to surface in Evelyn McKinley's case involved Justin Taylor's behavior and alibi. Now that the investigators had a voice recorder with a recording of his conversation with Betty Donovan, they couldn't help but dig further. The recording showed that Justin was far more involved in this conflict than he had admitted. Realizing that, at this point, Justin could no longer stay out of suspicion, the investigators took on the task of learning more about his past and the possible motives that drove him to act. A thorough investigation into Justin's personal life revealed interesting facts about his childhood. He grew up in a troubled family where there were frequent instances of aggressive behavior. His father had been arrested several times for threats and physical altercations, while his mother, according to neighbors, was always overwhelmed and unable to control her son's behavior. From a young age, Justin became accustomed to the idea that manipulation was the only way to get what he wanted. He was a smart child, but his intelligence was often directed toward darker intentions. As early as his school years, he demonstrated behavior that many found strange. He knew how to charm people and then exploit their weaknesses for his own gain. Upon learning this, investigators realized that Justin may have seen his relationships with Evelyn and Betty as not just a source of financial support, but a way to assert his power and control. His childhood and teenage years, filled with aggression and neglect, could have shaped his behavior. And now, finding himself between two women willing to do anything for him, he decided to use it to his fullest advantage. Investigators began questioning Justin's acquaintances and learned that shortly before Evelyn's death, he had shown a strong interest in matters of inheritance and life insurance. One of his former co-workers, with whom Justin often spoke informally, mentioned that Justin had asked about how to quickly receive money in the event of a loved one's passing. These words might have been part of his curiosity, but the investigators knew that in their case, there were no coincidences. The next important detail was the investigation of Justin's connection with a third woman, which surfaced during the inquiry. Investigators found out her name was Laura Hastings, and she had worked with Justin at his previous job. Laura was younger, and according to her friends, had a complicated relationship with Justin. Her friends described Justin as someone who inspired trust but always got his way, even if it required dishonest actions. Laura had repeatedly complained about his attempts to control her life, his constant calls, and his intrusive behavior. When investigators approached Laura, they discovered she was willing to share much more than they had anticipated. Laura stated that she was aware of Justin's relationships with Evelyn and Betty, and even tried to dissuade him from them. He said he needed them, that they were his chance to change his life for the better, she explained. Laura described how Justin often talked about his plans, and how he intended to gain complete control of the situation. Back then, these conversations seemed like mere fantasies to Laura, but now she understood they were part of his real plan. Furthermore, Laura provided the investigators with screenshots of conversations proving that Justin was actively discussing financial matters related to Evelyn with her. He wrote that he intended to convince Evelyn to sign over some of her savings to him and that he needed time to do it gently and discreetly. These messages became another piece of evidence showing that Justin had a clear plan to gain financial benefits from his relationships with the women. At the same time as Laura's statements, investigators conducted an examination of Evelyn's and Betty's bank accounts. It was revealed that Justin regularly withdrew money from their accounts, and the amounts weren't small. Although he insisted they were gifts, the investigators knew that the sums and frequency of transfers indicated something more than generosity. This money could have been used for his personal needs, including maintaining his relationship with Laura, who also suspected that her boyfriend was hiding his true motives. The investigation also uncovered another alarming detail. Just a few days before Evelyn's death, Justin purchased a large quantity of powerful sleeping pills. His explanation was that he suffered from insomnia, but the investigators knew that the sleeping pills played a key role in the events of that night. Analysis showed that Evelyn had been drugged before she was attacked. Now they knew that Justin had planned this in advance, and that the crime was premeditated rather than a spontaneous act of jealousy on Betty's part. As the investigators gathered more evidence, Justin began to lose his confidence. During questioning, he became increasingly inconsistent in his statements. His version of events changed, and he started to realize that the investigators saw through him. At one of the interrogations, when they showed him the conversations with Laura and the bank records, he became visibly nervous. He tried to deny everything, insisting that his words were taken out of context and that the money was given willingly by the women. But the investigators knew Justin was lying. During one of the interrogations, the investigators placed a voice recorder in front of Justin and played the recording of his conversation with Betty, where he effectively pushed her toward committing the crime. After that, they presented him with the screenshots of his conversations with Laura and the details of the sleeping pill purchase. Justin lost his composure and seemed, for the first time, to realize that his plan was failing. He tried to justify himself, saying he never intended for Evelyn to die, that he simply wanted to free himself from the pressure. But the investigators understood. His words were just an attempt to protect himself when there was no other way out. Meanwhile, Betty Donovan's attorney began pushing for a review of her case. Now that evidence of Justin's manipulation had surfaced, Betty's defense was based on her being a victim of circumstances and pressure from the young man. Her lawyer argued that Betty had been in an emotional breakdown and acted under the influence of threats and manipulations, making her actions unintentional. This version resonated with the public, and many Sudbury residents began to voice their opinion that Justin, not the elderly woman who had fallen into a trap, was the true culprit. The investigators continued to gather evidence, and gradually the picture became clearer. Justin had used both women for his purposes, seeking money and control. He preyed on their fears, feelings, and desire to be needed. His manipulations led one to become capable of committing a crime, while the other became a victim. The investigators realized that this was not just a domestic conflict, but a tragedy in which each side ended up as both a victim of manipulation and their own weaknesses. The next step for the investigation was to tie all the gathered evidence into a single case and prove Justin's guilt in court. They understood that public opinion was already starting to lean in Betty's favor, and this could work to their advantage. They needed to prove that Justin had consciously and deliberately pushed the women to actions that led to the tragedy. It wasn't easy, as Justin, despite his nervousness, continued to deny his guilt and tried to present himself as a victim of circumstances. One of the last pieces of evidence that emerged was provided by Evelyn's neighbor, Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman living across the street. She recalled seeing Justin leaving Evelyn's house on the night of the crime, and that he looked worried and was in a hurry. This testimony became the final element the investigators needed to fully link Justin to the scene of the crime at the time it occurred. Now the investigators had enough evidence to charge him. When Justin was officially charged with being an accomplice in the crime, he realized the game was over. His face twisted with anger and fear. He was no longer the confident young man who could manipulate two elderly women like puppets. Now he was merely a criminal caught in his own web of intrigue and manipulation. His arrest caused a wide public reaction, and many believed that justice had finally been served. The investigators understood that their work was not yet done. They still had to bring the case to court and do everything possible to ensure that all those responsible were punished. It was a difficult case without black and white answers. Every side of this tragedy was both guilty and a victim. But one thing was clear: manipulation, greed, and a desire for power had led to devastating consequences, and now all the participants in this drama had to face responsibility for their actions. The trial of Justin Taylor and Betty Donovan marked the culmination of the tragedy that had unfolded in Sudbury. The courtroom was filled not only with witnesses and relatives, but also with numerous town residents who had followed the story from the very beginning. Everyone wanted to see how this tangled story would end, with each new revelation uncovering new layers of manipulation, deceit, and despair. The proceedings began with the presentation of evidence and testimonies gathered throughout the investigation. The prosecutor started with the recording of Justin urging Betty to take drastic action against Evelyn. This recording was one of the key pieces of evidence that shed light on Justin's true role in the drama. The prosecutor then introduced messages between Justin and Laura, his third girlfriend, in which he discussed plans to gain financial benefits from his relationships with Evelyn and Betty. Laura's testimony became another important element of the case. She described how Justin openly told her about his intention to use both women to gain money and control over their lives. She also confirmed that he had shown great interest in inheritance and insurance matters, which further fueled suspicions about his motives. Laura looked dejected. It was difficult for her to share such details, but she understood that her testimony could help bring justice. The next stage was Betty's testimony. Her attorney insisted that she had acted under Justin's manipulative influence. Betty, appearing exhausted and confused, confirmed that she had been in love with the young man and was willing to do anything not to lose him. She described how Justin made her believe that Evelyn was an obstacle to their happiness, and that the only way out was to get rid of her. These words were full of pain and despair, and the judges seemed to sympathize with her. Many in the courtroom understood that Betty had fallen victim to her own emotions and become a pawn in Justin's game. The prosecutor also presented financial documents proving that Justin had regularly withdrawn money from Evelyn's and Betty's accounts. These transactions were consistent and involved significant sums, indicating that he had used both women for his own benefit. Furthermore, the prosecutor provided records of the purchase of sleeping pills that were used on the night of the crime. The prosecutor argued that Justin had planned the crime in advance, intending to first drug Evelyn and then push Betty to commit the act to shift suspicion away from himself. Justin's defense was built on the argument that he had no intention of harming Evelyn and that his words had been distorted and taken out of context. His lawyer argued that Justin was merely trying to help Betty and Evelyn, and that his actions were never meant to lead to such tragic consequences. Justin looked nervous and dejected. The confidence he had at the beginning of the investigation had completely disappeared. Now he was trying to justify himself, claiming he didn't understand the consequences of his words and actions. However, the testimony of Mrs. Harper, Evelyn's neighbor, proved decisive. She confirmed that she had seen Justin near Evelyn's house on the night of the crime, and that he appeared worried and in a hurry. This became the final nail in his defense. Mrs. Harper's testimony showed that Justin had been at the scene of the crime, which completely destroyed his alibi. Now it was clear that he had not only manipulated the women, but had also personally taken part in the crime. Once all the evidence had been presented, and both sides had made their arguments, the judges retired to deliberate. The wait for the verdict was tense. The courtroom was silent, interrupted only by the whispers of journalists and spectators. No one knew what the outcome would be, and many wondered what punishment would match the severity of the crimes committed. The verdict was announced several hours later. Justin Taylor was found guilty of being an accomplice to the crime and of intentionally pushing another person to commit the act. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, without the possibility of parole for the first 15 years. The judges noted that his actions were cold-blooded and calculated, and that he used his ability to manipulate people to achieve his goals. The sentence was seen as fair by those in the courtroom, and many felt a sense of relief that the person behind such tragic events would finally face justice. Betty Donovan was also found guilty, but her crime was classified as an act committed in the heat of the moment, influenced by threats and manipulation. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years for good behavior. The judges took into account her age, emotional state, and the degree of pressure exerted on her by Justin. In their decision, they noted that Betty had become a victim of manipulation and that her actions were provoked by the difficult circumstances she found herself in. After the verdict was announced, Betty could not hold back her tears. Her attorney supported her, and many in the courtroom also showed sympathy. Her fate became a tragic example of how manipulation and emotional coercion can drive a person to commit a crime. Meanwhile, Justin, upon hearing the verdict, sat in silence, his face expressionless. He understood that he could no longer control the situation, and that all his attempts to evade responsibility had failed. The trial marked the end of the tragedy that had shaken the small town of Sudbury for a long time. Many residents felt that justice had been served, but no one could forget the devastating consequences brought on by Justin's and Betty's actions. Evelyn McKinley remained in people's memory as a victim who simply wanted love and care, but ended up being pulled into a dangerous game of manipulation and control. After the trial, the town gradually began to return to normal life. However, this story left a deep mark on the hearts of many. It became a reminder of how dangerous manipulation can be, and how easily one can become a victim when caught in the trap of emotions and promises. The story of Evelyn, Betty, and Justin showed that no one is immune from getting caught up in a dark game where the stakes are life and fate. The investigators who worked on this case were also deeply affected by what had happened. For them, this investigation had been one of the most challenging and emotionally draining in their careers. They saw how love and jealousy could become tools of destruction, how people could exploit others' weaknesses to achieve their own goals. This case served as a lesson for everyone involved, reminding them of the importance of honesty, compassion, and responsibility. The people of Sudbury discussed the story for a long time. Some saw Justin as the embodiment of evil, using people for his own gain. Others believed that he too was a victim of his troubled childhood and circumstances that made him who he was. Whatever people thought, one thing was clear: manipulation, greed, and a desire for power could lead to tragic consequences, and it was important to remember that behind every action are real people and their lives. Laura Hastings, who testified against Justin, also found the strength to start a new life. She left Sudbury, deciding that she needed to leave all these memories behind and start fresh. Her decision was understandable. There was too much pain and sorrow associated with this town. She hoped that in a new place she could find peace and forget what she had been through. Betty Donovan, while serving her sentence, began working with psychologists to understand her feelings and how she ended up involved in this tragedy. Her journey to forgiving herself was long and difficult, but she hoped to find the strength to live on despite everything that had happened. Her story became a lesson for many, a lesson on the importance of not allowing others to control your life and the dangers of following someone else's manipulations. Justin Taylor, left alone in his prison cell, could no longer hide behind his smiles and charm. He was now face to face with the consequences of his actions, knowing that no one would cater to his whims anymore. He was now just an inmate, a man who had lost everything because of his desire for power and control. His fate became a reminder that manipulation and greed never lead to true happiness, but only to destruction and loneliness. Months passed, and life in Sudbury gradually returned to its routine. People went back to their daily concerns, but this story remained in their memory as an example of how far human weaknesses can go and the importance of not letting them take control. The story of Evelyn, Betty, and Justin became part of the town's history, reminding everyone that we are all responsible for our actions and that justice will eventually prevail, even if the path to it is long and difficult. The investigators concluded their work on this case, but for them, it served as a reminder of how complex human relationships can be and the importance of not stopping halfway, even when everything seems tangled and hopeless. They knew that many more difficult cases lay ahead, but each of them was ready for new challenges, knowing that their work was not just about finding evidence, but about striving to bring justice to those who had fallen victim to others' actions.